Welcome to the second panel or session for today. Trade we have versus trade we want, making agricultural trade just, nature positive and supportive of climate action. So my name is Mari Carlson. I am moderating this session and I am the co-coordinator of the MATS project. So today, and especially in this session, we are aiming at a better understanding of how sustainable is global agricultural trade. We are asking what are the trending discussions and emerging issues linked to environmental and social sustainability, both globally but also locally. Eventually, we are looking for an answer to what kind of agricultural trade we need and want, especially noting the changing climate. To shed light to these questions, we have 5 distinguished speakers with us today. We will start with our 2 guests who are setting the scene, and this is followed by views from 3 expert panelists. So with further ado, let's begin. And to set the scene, we have first Flavio Coturni from the European Commission, who works as a head of unit in agriculture, food and sanitary and phytosanitary measures and matters in DG Trade. Welcome, Flavio. And then our second guest setting the scene is Christophe Peillot, who is the Trade Policy Director from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Belgium. And he is also the chair of the Trade Policy Committee, TPC, for the Belgian presidency of the European Council. Welcome, Christophe. So let me begin with you, Flavio. So what are the key discussions and emerging issues linked to environmental and social sustainability within the global trading system, especially those linked to sustainable agriculture?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event. Well, this is a question which is a nice question as an introduction, which could take, maybe hours of introduction. So I will try to refrain and be as short as possible, because I think you are already aware, and this audience I think is already aware of what are the major issues and discussions ongoing on agricultural trade and sustainability. We have definitely a number of initiatives which have been taken by the EU, some of which have been turned into legislation and will have to be implemented. Some others are still in the process of proposals which are being adopted by the College, by the Commission, and then to be discussed before the Council and the European Parliament. And all of these initiatives, both those which have already been adopted and those which are in the course of adoption, are creating a new environment in terms of how we approach trade in agriculture vis-à-vis sustainability issues, and how sustainability issues are integrated or mainstreamed into the agricultural trade policy. This is creating a new environment, a new perspective into trade, which definitely was not so present until 5 years ago with the new political climate, in particular the elections in the European Parliament, the new Commission, the Green Deal, and so on and so forth. So I would say that the discussion is welcoming these, so to say, new or, if you wish, reinforced approach on sustainability in agri-food trade. At the same time, and I do not want to anticipate discussion later on that certainly we can have here, this is creating concerns in the agricultural community worldwide, concerns in terms of what and to what extent these sustainability commitments can actually be integrated into the world discussion on environment and sustainability, but also social conditions, and to what extent the EU can and should can or should, or can and should, pursue this agenda, and by which means and through which tools. And I think this is something which is occupying our time and our resources in terms of trying to persuade and define a setting whereby we can go along with the other members, trade partners in the world, to make sure that the transition that we have set as a priority for the EU is also a transition towards a more sustainable and greener agro-food system in the world, not only in the EU.
Thank you, Flavio. And I think you very nicely started to bring up the current topics, especially the Green Deal, and also the novelty that sustainability actually, the nature of novelty that it has in trade policy. So it has not always been there, perhaps in a very small amount, but now it's really making its way there, and that's creating concerns, even though we would perhaps think that sustainability is automatically something that we want and that should be good. But then it's not only us, it's of course internal concerns, but also our trade partners are a little bit afraid of the impacts of these sustainability initiatives. So you guided us a little bit towards the second question. What I'm going to now ask is that what are the EU's current sustainability objectives and priorities with regard to international agricultural trade? So if you can especially specify the agricultural trade. And perhaps also, what are the kind of points or issues that the EU get a lot of positive feedback, and then perhaps those issues that the third countries are concerned of?
Yes, thank you. This indeed, this question allows to go more probably into the details of what we're doing and what type of concerns are this policy is creating towards trade partners. Definitely, we have a number of objectives which we try to pursue in the multilateral, bilateral system, but also through autonomous measures. And we're trying to achieve these in a way which is not by imposing actually elements of sustainability within agri-food trade, but by persuading, talking to our partners and trying to achieve commitments together. Now, in the multilateral system, definitely this is being done through the standard-setting bodies like Codex FAO, Codex Alimentarius FAO, which is a norms-setting body which defines definitely some of the regulatory issues which are applying multilaterally, and we always try to encourage this way of doing things, because once you define regulatory issues at a multilateral level, then definitely this is a guarantee that members will follow through these international commitments. The WTO is a route which we are trying to reinforce. There's just been the ministerial in Abu Dhabi, and a number of initiatives have been taken. For example, in the margins of the ministerial meeting, there has been a meeting of the trade ministers, or the coalition of trade ministers for environment, which is trying to inject a new momentum and define a high-level platform and discussion on climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, and this is something which is very positive. We're trying also as a Commission, but also as the EU in general, we're trying to also to use the WTO to make sure that some policy deliberations can be taken within this international forum, to make sure that the environment is part of the policy deliberation to be taken in the context of the reform of the WTO. And also WTO is also a context where we have a number of plurilateral initiatives which we are taking with a number of countries, in which we're trying to feed into the WTO also context. We have the bilateral route. We have a number of free trade agreements, especially the new generation. Some of these are actually now being integrated with a reinforced commitment, which can go ultimately to a panel compliance in case these commitments are not complied with. Commitments in the context of multilateral environmental agreements or in the context of the ILO conventions on labor rules. These are integrating part of the FTA. We have also a new chapter which is called the Sustainable Food System chapter, which also does it work? Is it better? Yes. Which incorporates some of the commitments to cooperate with the partner in terms of animal welfare, use of pesticides, and antimicrobial treatment. And this is also part of the new generation of FTAs. For example, we have negotiated this chapter with Chile and New Zealand. And then we have the autonomous route, whereby we, as the EU, take a special responsibility in defining what are the measures that we think not only are useful and inducive towards a more sustainable food system in the EU, but where we think also that through trade we can contribute to a more sustainable food system, agri-food system. And of course, deforestation comes as on top of this list, the deforestation regulation, which is now in force and will be implemented towards the end of this year. We have a number of other considerations like due diligence and so on. And specifically in the agri-food sector, we have a number of autonomous initiatives which we took, for example, in terms of pesticides use, whereby we can define whether a certain substance or pesticides is not authorized in the EU and is harmful for the biodiversity, or it could be harmful for pollinators. In this case, we, under certain conditions, we apply these autonomous measures also to imported products to avoid that the use of these substances in the production of these products in the third country could be harmful also for biodiversity or in terms of emissions, which may be the case in other instances. And through these autonomous measures, we try to contribute to a more sustainable agri-food system by means of conditions that we set on imported products. I know that this is creating concerns for sure, and we're trying to address these concerns in a number of fora through discussions in the WTO, bilaterally, through the committees that we have in the trade agreements. A number of platforms have been set in motion to address these concerns and trying to explain why these measures are not only useful, but they are done also legally in terms of compliance with the WTO, so to make sure that there is full trust in the measures that the EU is taking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, you mentioned a very long list of priorities and initiatives, and I think this wasn't even exhaustive because I know there are much more. And I would love to discuss with you for hours, I think, about the changing turn or the turn in trade policy when the EU is taking up more autonomous measures. And of course, it's about the geopolitical context also that is affecting that. But it's an extremely interesting topic, and I hope that we will hear more about that today. But also what I picked up from your intervention and about the concerns that you said, I looked at there are two sides of the coin. The EU wants to show the leadership in green transition, which is extremely great. And we have heard a lot of critique that the EU is actually now doing autonomous action and like being very turned inside, so to say, and not listening to the third parties or trade partners. But as you said, you're really trying to keep the channels open, the multilateral level, which is important, and you are also taking up actions bilaterally to raise the concerns and solve the problems. So world is changing, we hope for the better. And this was a very interesting setting the scene part from you, Flavio. So I thank you at this point, and then we will turn back to you later. Now, I would then turn to our second setting the scene guest, Christoph. So the first question for you would then be, what are your presidency priorities on sustainable trade? And if you could especially elaborate the links to agricultural trade and land use. And also if you could then perhaps say some words about what the presidency champions vis-à-vis improving the role of smallholders in this equation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. Good morning to all. So Flavio have already set the scene very well about what the EU is doing. Of course, trade policy is an exclusive competence of the EU, so the Commission is in the lead. So maybe I will say a few words maybe to some more general observations and focusing on the nexus also between trade, environment, climate, and agriculture. So in terms of agriculture, the major priority for the Belgian presidency is the transition towards a more sustainable and resilient food production system, as well as towards a more balanced consumption model. We put also a lot of emphasis on policy coherence in the areas of trade, environment, and climate. This is key because everything reinforces each other. So green just transition is overall also a top priority for us, and this is needed to address the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So transition to a more sustainable agriculture is then definitely needed, but also it's important to keep strengthening our competitiveness. This is also an important priority for us in agriculture, because it's important to recall that it's indeed of strategic importance that agriculture continues to provide our daily food needs in the future. So agriculture must retain its central role in EU resilience and open strategic autonomy. Food production with a consistently high level of safety, animal and plant health, and energy efficiency is at the same time necessary. We believe that our trade policy should be in line with those objectives, and this is why in our motto for the trade policy program of our presidency we said trade for prosperous and resilient EU in a fairer world. Overall, for the trade policy, we want an ambitious and balanced trade policy based on the three pillars of openness, sustainability, and assertiveness. So sustainability is for us a very important pillar, and we also want to make important emphasis on the implementation of trade agreements in all their dimensions, but also the sustainability dimension. Flavio referred to the new model, the new generation of trade agreements, but there is also a way to implement the new approach in existing and older trade agreements. More specifically on the issue of agriculture, we have also an important emphasis on, nobody can be left behind. And we also want to defend a European model of family farming. So the smallholders, this is important, and it gives a best guarantee for sustainable, resilient, just and fair production. So it's necessary to defend the farmers' position in the supply chain. We have heard a lot about this issue and the importance of that issue over the last few weeks, but this is key for farmers also to get a fair revenue covering the production cost. Another area of attention is about the level playing field at not only at the European level but also at the international level, and all the issues of standards and norms. This is also a focus of attention. Regarding climate and in the link with climate and environment, we also believe that agriculture is not the problem, but it's part of the solution, and that's why the link between environmental and agricultural regulation is essential to make sure that everything remains coherent. Final point on local trade and short supply chain. So this is also a very important and also a good response to climate and environmental goals. But at the same time, not every region, country can be competitive in all products, so trade remains essential to respond to food sovereignty, but also to global demand. So when the EU as a whole is still a net exporter of food, of agri-food. So I will maybe leave it there, and happy to go a bit deeper on all those issues later on during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it was a really nice introduction to the content of what you do throughout your presidency. And also I picked the increasing policy coherence between sustainability and trade. It's a little bit the same as Flavio referred to. And then you also raised competitiveness, resilience, and the trade agreements as a tool to improve the sustainability of agriculture. No one should be left behind, which refers to the fairness, and also what we do in both projects. We are trying to find ways to make agricultural trade also more fair. So it's really nice to hear that it's on your list. And then also very delighted to hear about the family farms, that it's on your, let's say, high on your agenda, and how you are trying to also bring the resilience, fairness, and sustainability through small farming. Let's move on to the second question. So how does the presidency plan to take forward EU trade policy in support of climate goals, including in the light of our WTO MC13 outcomes last week, where I think you have been involved very intensively?
Thank you. Indeed, I was in Abu Dhabi last week for the 13th Ministerial Conference of the WTO. Flavio referred to this climate coalition of, the climate coalition of trade ministers that met just before. So this is an important also. Oh, excuse me, it's presidency calling. So there was an important gathering also of ministers from various parts of the world, also to show that trade is also important for climate change, to raise also more awareness and make sure there is more coherence between trade, climate, environment, but also with the finance ministers. So this is an initiative that is picking up with more and more members from all over the world. So the European Commission is one of the co-chairs, but also with countries from all over the world, Ecuador, Kenya, New Zealand, and so it's is picking up in terms of membership. So it was positive with some, commitments that have been taken, not only for the negotiations at MC13, but also after. Unfortunately, the level of ambition that we all had for MC13 in terms of environment was not met in the outcome document, but doesn't mean that it's the end of the road. On the contrary, I mean, we can see that there is a big number of member states who want to continue those discussions on environment and various initiatives, including on fisheries subsidies. So, I mean, there is. We will continue, and the EU will continue to work on that. But what I could also mention in terms of WTO in general is also that, and the link with climate change, that the WTO released a report back in 2022 claiming also that trade has an important role for climate, fighting in support of climate change policies and objectives. So trade is often associated with CO2 emissions for transport and production. In fact, production is even higher than the transport emissions. But WTO believes that trade is key for the green transition. The Director General Ngozi said that trade is a force for good for climate and part of the solution for achieving a low carbon, resilient and just transition. Trade and trade policy can accelerate the dissemination of cutting edge technologies and best practices and enhance incentives for further innovation while creating the jobs of tomorrow. So trade and trade policy can also be used for strategies for each country, and in particular the most vulnerable one, to adapt to climate change. So also having more trade of environmental goods and services could also contribute to facilitating access to those products and reduce overall also the carbon emissions. So this is according to this 2022 WTO report. Then in terms of the EU level, also maybe just to stress the importance that we as Belgian presidency attach to the implementation, as I said, of trade agreements in all their dimensions. And so 2 years ago, the EU adopted a new approach regarding trade and sustainable development. It has been implemented since. We have seen it with the agreement with New Zealand in particular, but also with some other agreements. So we need to continue that work, and we are planning to do that in the coming months to make sure that we can implement those new measures. Some can be implemented without changing the agreement itself, so it can also apply to older agreements in terms of involvement of civil society or dialogue through the various committees that are in place. I mean, a lot can be discussed, including those explaining the measures that the EU is taking, autonomous measures, as it was discussed earlier, but also to see how the EU can assist countries to implement those measures. So it's not only communication, but it's also assistance, and there a lot can be done also, because the more we cooperate through trade, the more we can also contribute to sustainability.
Thank you. That was very insightful. And regarding the MC13, very nice that you raised the coalition of trade ministers, as also here before, and you mentioned also the finance. That is a really important component in basically trade and greening. And I think there has been some work initiated to bring together trade and investments for more greener trade, more climate solutions, more climate adaptation. And I think that finance is one of those underpinning issues that is making the negotiations also at the WTO so difficult, or not only the negotiations, but the work on trade and environment, because there is no finance for that. And that's also something that we, again, in our projects, we discuss the kind of the connection between trade and investments, and how could we then empower investments and make basically the production more sustainable, and then also the trade more sustainable. And basically what I wanted also to raise from that was that you mentioned that EU is very ambitious. You both here mentioned that EU is very ambitious on putting environmental issues forward multilaterally and bilaterally. Sometimes it feels a little bit weird that the EU is blamed for not being sustainable, and on the other hand, EU is blamed for not being ambitious enough. So there is like a contradiction also on those talks at the multilateral level, but I think it always comes down again to the finance and the capacities that different countries have, because we have so many countries and diverse countries as a member of the WTO that it makes things a little bit difficult. But thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our part setting the scene. And according to my schedule, we are very well going as I planned. So now I'm turning to our expert panelists. So let me briefly introduce them all. They are scattered here around. So first we have Beatriz Fernandez, who is the Associate Program Management Officer at UNEP Trade and Environment Hub. Then we have Geneviève Pons, who is the Director General and Vice President Europe Jacques Delors. And then we have Matthew Langdon, who is an Associate in the Trade Program at European Climate Foundation. So I'm going to begin with Beatriz. So the first question for you would be that could you give your brief reflections on the state of and the development towards sustainable agriculture and agricultural trade?
Thank you, Mary. And I want to first thank to Marianne, to Jonathan, and to Oxfam for this invitation, to obviously the EESC as well. And then thank you also for the opportunity to share these discussions with such interesting and expert panels as well. I just wanted to offer a few reflections, and I'm sure this is not news for any of you because you're agriculture experts, but I just really wanted to put ourselves in the context that restating the evident, this unsustainable consumption and production patterns are actually driving what Christoph has already referred to as these triple planetary crises. And those crises are nature loss, climate change, and pollution, and they are interconnected. So when we talk about each of them, they're not acting in silos. And agriculture sector, as we know, it accounted for 88% of global deforestation between 2000 and 2018, but it also connected to climate change because it's responsible for 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just trying to create that linkages with numbers here. But is also agriculture one of the main supporters of the livelihoods of around 500 million smallholders around the world, and many of them are women. So this is a very, very important sector. However, the environmental footprint of agriculture has also been perpetuated by perverse public incentives. In 2021, we released a report with UNEP, FAO, and UNDP that actually identified that governments are spending $540 billion per year on subsidies to agriculture. But out of this, 87% are actually harmful, not only to the environment, but also to human health. So that's really putting us a picture. And if we continue with this trend, actually this support could reach $1.8 trillion by 2030. So while we see that agriculture and trade has actually been increasing consistently, we have also seen those developments that you're asking me today to help advance a more sustainable agriculture trade. And I won't repeat anything about the WTO because already Flavio and Christophe really gave us the flavor of Abu Dhabi. But I want to also add the perspective that last week also in Abu Dhabi, while the MC13 was happening, we also had the UN Environment Assembly, which is the biggest body of the UN that gets together to determine the environmental agenda in the coming year. And that happened in Nairobi, in Kenya. And I would invite you to take a look at UNEA 6 with all the resolutions that were adopted. And one of those that were adopted was actually the invitation to start taking measures to tackle hazardous pesticides to agriculture. So this is a group of countries that are leading that resolution, that are now inviting the more than 150 members that are part of the Assembly of Environment to take action on agriculture. So the question here is, how do we use the momentum of all these trade developments, because the WTO has been successful at launching the ministerial statements in 2021, saying, let's talk about trade and environmental sustainability, let's talk about fossil fuel subsidies reform, let's talk about pollution. And then that went later in 2022 with the fisheries subsidies agreement that was very successful. I know many of you would be thinking, well, it took 20 years. It's true, it took 20 years, but it managed to achieve that at the multilateral space. So that's really giving us hope and really sending the signal from the trade community to say, let's talk about trade, because we recognize the linkages. And not only trade, but we also see now the very clear linkages with the sustainable development. So in the previous panel, we heard a lot about the smallholders, and that's really tackling. So I will just close by offering some reflections on how these developments can actually help us move towards a more sustainable agriculture and what's the role of trade. So first of all, we need to harness the power of trade to eliminate these environmentally harmful subsidies that I was mentioning before. And these could actually be redirected to, for example, financing nature-based solutions, financing or providing investments for provisions of goods and services for agriculture, so R&D, sustainable production practices. This actually can help countries implement and deliver on the targets of the global biodiversity framework that was adopted. So there are different targets that are not explicitly on trade, but are definitely linked to it, such as pesticides and subsidies and sustainable production systems for agriculture, for fisheries, or forestry. So there are a lot of linkages that we can actually do. There's a second element, and I'm going to close with this one, which is really enabling trade and the fiscal policy environment to allow this. We've been hearing a lot now that fiscal finance, and we see at UNEP that connection between trade finance, because you need your resources to implement the solutions that you want to put forward. And my last point here is about the smallholders, because this is one of the recurrent topics here. And we're talking about the smallholders in Europe, but also the smallholders that are in other countries that are sending the products to different markets. And these smallholders, actually, one of the interesting numbers that I found was that 84% of the 570 million farms that exist worldwide, there are small holdings. So that's telling us how important and what are the core of these economies and the backbones that smallholders represent. Many of those smallholders, as we can imagine, are in developing countries in the global south. So how do we create also, as I said, that combination of trade and fiscal policy environment to help them be part of this transition to be more sustainable, so that, as Christophe was saying before, and Flavio as well, nobody is left behind. So I think I will conclude with that as for developments.
Thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed you putting the numbers on what you were explaining, because we always need to have numbers on when we state these things. Also, I really like that you raised environmentally harmful subsidies, which are a broad category of different subsidies, including the fossil fuel subsidies or agricultural subsidies or state subsidies. Then you raised the trade finance, very important thing, and also the importance of smallholders. So that was a really insightful opening and an answer to the first question. So let me now move to the second question. So last year, in 2023, UNEP carried out a set of regional consultations on nature-positive trade for sustainable supply chains in agriculture in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So could you tell us what were the key insights and ways forward arising from these consultations, and also including how we could really integrate these aspects into, well, discussions, but especially in concrete decision-making processes?
Thank you, and I promise I'll stick to my targeted time because I was quite open in the statement before. So in this Trade Hub project that you probably have had the opportunity to learn a bit more, and Marianne in the previous panel was giving us a glimpse. We went to the regions last year in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. I had the opportunity to work with my wonderful Trade Hub partners, Luisi, Jonas, and Harry that you met today. And there were two key objectives to go to the regions. One was really to take the pulse of the region. So let us understand what are your challenges, what are your priorities, but also what are the opportunities. And the second objective was, okay, now that we understand better what's happening in the region, and even within regions, there's so much diversity because countries are so different sometimes. The second and the most important objective is, how do we build a vision and a way forward for the region to advance towards a more sustainable agriculture sector, and what's the role of trade in all of this? Understanding the particularities of each country, of each region. Certainly one of the key things that we have happily discovered in those consultations, and I am based in Geneva, so you can imagine that sometimes that opportunity to touch base with reality doesn't come very often. So that was really a very insightful experience. It's about, there are already good practices happening. Things are happening well. So the first thing is, we don't need to do everything from scratch. We don't need to invent everything. But then how do we help escalate that? How do we help amplify? We did some particularities, we did some tailoring, but there are good things that are happening in those regions. So how do we escalate that? Secondly, certainly there are some conversations about the change in market regulations. Certainly EUDR was part of that conversation. But surprisingly, it was not a conversation about the potential challenges that the EUDR will bring. It's rather what opportunities EUDR can bring to the region so that we can actually seize them and we can actually find a more sustainable development and economic growth in our economy. Certainly, UNEP is an environment agency, so that's our main mandate, but we also recognize that for countries, economic and social development are priorities. So we really need to cater for those needs, and we need to find those synergies. I won't go into details about the key lessons because I think in the previous panel, Luisi and Jonas have covered them really extensively. But I would say again that access to finance, that's a key thing that came across the three regions. Whether you need to put in place traceability systems, when you need to put in place a better and more sustainable production practices or technologies or capacity building or upskilling, you need access to financing programs. And it comes to things like Luisi was saying, the rights to land. You cannot prove that is your land because it comes from ancestors. So how do you show that is your land? You don't have your permit. You don't get access to funding. So financing programs that allow all the stakeholders to get those means to implement. And the second point that I will add, and I'll conclude here, is having social security measures. So what happens when a farmer is sick and he or she cannot go to work? And that's main income. What do you do when you don't have the same conditions that Europe provides in terms of working conditions? So how do you keep that? Because for them, it's really about selling my cocoa today to feed my family today, and then we'll see tomorrow. But then equally, they have a very key role in the full value chain globally. And the third point, and I said two, but the third point that I wanted to mention as well is that regions are really keen to start becoming a hub for sustainable agriculture and trade. So rather than having this reactive approach of there's a new market regulation, I need to comply with it, it's really shifting the mindset as in, how do I go ahead of a regulation eventually? How do I take a proactive approach? And that could actually come with policy coherence and those really trying to look at what is happening in the market regulations and the direction that they're pushing for on sustainability, on environment, on social security. And so how do I align to all of that? So I think that was a very important lesson that we obtained from those consultations, because it's really that mindset, and it's not only the mindset, but it's translating that into political decisions. And so having the ecosystem with your research that is informing your decisions, with your investment, and with your enabling policy environment to make that a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And, well, I mean, I think we heard also in the first session that the good practices exist, and the main question really is how do we amplify that, and that's, I think that's the pressing question for not only for the EU, not only for a certain developing country, but like all the countries, and then also who defines sustainability. And can we trust that the sustainability, the definition of sustainability now will last for the next 10 or 20 years? Because that's also very important when farmers anywhere in the world prepare for any kind of regulations. But that was really nice to hear that the farmers are becoming very proactive and not reactive. And it's also, I think, because sustainability is not something fancy or something first class. It's about the viability of the soil. It's about everything when you produce food. So if you're not sustainable and your environment is not doing well, it's also deteriorating your yields and everything. So that was really nice to hear. So I will now have the third question for you. So could you very briefly give your perspective, and based on the work you do, how good the EU show leadership in the international fora to support sustainable agricultural trade?
Yeah, and I will probably start with numbers again. And you probably have seen that on the 1st of March, the EU announced a contribution of 1 million euros to the WTO Global Trust Fund. And actually, that contribution will be used to finance programs for governments, government officials in developing countries, especially LDCs, to build their capacity to be part of, be more active in the international trade. So it's really understanding what are the opportunities for them to become more active in this trading system. So I think as a start, that's already telling us that the EU has a very clear path on continuing that leadership. I'm not, of course, saying that it has not happened before this 1 million euro contribution. I'm just saying that this is also translating into actually let's finance something for developing countries, and there's a lot of synergies as well with the Global South. Certainly we see, and we have also heard before from Christoph and Flavio, how active the EU has been in the international trading setting. We, because of the nature of our work, we follow a lot of the discussions and support members of the WTO, and we definitely see the EU quite active across different committees, and certainly with these initiatives on the Trade and Environmental Sustainability, the TESTI, if some of you have been following that have some specific elements on sustainable supply chain. So that's really becoming an interesting part, and also on subsidies, that has a very interesting element on agricultural subsidies. So there's definitely the EU established leadership on that front. I would say that going forward, there's also a need to continue greening trade policies. So this is really important. We start seeing as a parallel example the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that was adopted, and now there are works to negotiate how to include environmental considerations across several protocols. So that is really sending the signal that at the level of regional trade agreements, there's really a development, and I think the EU would be also playing a very important role on that, on, as I said, greening trade policies and agreements, certainly boosting South-to-South investments, but also global North and global South cooperation, and global and different cooperations across. And I just want to close with the finance element, because I think this is quite important, and that's where the EU has also shown leadership, and I think could also be a way forward. Because in these conversations, climate change has been coming up, I also wanted to share that at the Climate COP last year, the initiative on finance at UNEP, is called UNEP FI, they launched this Net Zero Export Credit Agencies Alliance. And it's the first type of this alliance where they're bringing public and private sector, public and private finance together to help decarbonize global trade. So that is an example that if we could replicate that, for example, for agriculture, that could be one initiative that could be setting the path as into more action. Certainly, we have talked about capacity building and technical assistance, and the producer countries needing to comply with the regulations that are changing, that are coming up. And then we have, of course, the WTO Aid for Trade mechanism. And this year in June, they are reviewing their program, and they have 3 pillars, and one of those pillars is food security, which is really important right now. As Leonard was saying in the previous panel, this geopolitical situation is something that we also need to be mindful of, because it's not only just producing food, but we have all this geopolitical context. So aid for trade can actually play an important role, and the EU is a key contributor on that. So that's really another pathway forward, because it provides resources for developing countries, for LDCs to start building their capacity to be able to access markets, to adopt sustainable production practices. In this case, for agriculture, could be very good. And my last point is creating synergies with the multilateral environmental agreements. I mean, EU has been very active and quite a leading actor on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We don't see yet a very natural connection between trade, environment, biodiversity, agriculture, but we're starting to see more and more. And as the GBF starts to develop now its implementation plan, that is one of the avenues where we see the EU playing a key role to make this connection of these 3 agendas a reality.
Thank you very much. And I think that we are very glad to hear also this praise for the EU for being very active and providing finance as well. It's very welcome, I think, in this room. You provided such a great overview of things and topics for making trade more sustainable, where you really underlined the importance of investment and trade finance. So let's take this as one of the key messages from your intervention, and we thank you very much at this point. And now we will move on to my left, if my neck still turns. So our next panelist is Geneviève Pons. And Geneviève, give your brief reflection on how sustainable is global agricultural trade.
Thank you very much. Maybe as I am a newcomer in this meeting, just a few words on Europe Jacques Delors and our publications on greening trade. We created Europe Jacques Delors with Pascal Lamy a few years ago. And you know about Pascal Lamy, of course. You probably don't know about myself. I was a member of the cabinet of Jacques Delors in charge of environment. I was with him in Rio. And when I created Europe Jacques Delors, I was heading WWF European office. So we decided to put our expertises together and to write about this very important issue of greening trade, and we started on that in 2019. We wrote about the CBAM, we wrote about macro measures, and so on. So now, to answer your question, I will make 4 points. First one, there are positive elements in trade in agri-food products. Second, there are negative elements. Third, we have taken measures to try to tackle this negative element. And finally, these measures we have taken have themselves negative impacts, and so we have to tackle them. So, first, there are positive aspects. You all know about the question of allocation of resources. So trade is favoring a good allocation of resources. If you, I will give you an example. Let's imagine that Saudi Arabia decides to cultivate cereals. Let's imagine the impact on, for instance, water resources that it will represent. So it is much better that they don't try and that they import cereals, which are cultivated in a place which is more favorable to this activity. Also, resources, financial resources. Let's imagine that farmers in Kenya cannot cultivate and export flowers to EU market. It will make them much poorer. So that's the second aspect. And finally, you have technology transfers that are favored by trading. So there are positive aspects. But we all know that there are also negative aspects. The most striking one is that agriculture is at the origin of 90% of deforestation worldwide. As far as tropical forests are concerned, 70% of the loss in tropical forest is coming from trading in agri-commodities like soy, palm oil, cattle, cacao, timber, and so on. So that these impacts trigger also a big loss in biodiversity. We all know about what happened to orangutan, for instance, and also the depletion of soils and an aggravation of climate change through the diminution of carbon sinks. So we have to tackle these negative effects, and this is my third point. And this has been done notably in the EU by the adoption of the EU deforestation regulation, which concerns 7 commodities, and which should enter into force at the end of this year, and which should trigger transformation of agri-food commodities production elsewhere in the world. However, and that's my fourth point, what we probably did not measure properly is the impact on especially smallholders in developing countries. And Beatrice gave us some figures about these smallholders. So it represents, 400 million people around the world, and we must pay attention to the effect of the measures that we have adopted on them. We work with UNEP and others in the Trade Hub on this question, and we benefit from the insight that Beatrice has given us. And we come up with recommendations on how to tackle this problem. We have to be very specific, sector-specific and country-specific. We have to go on site, so field trips are necessary, like the one that you described in Latin America, and to look at the potential impacts, but also, as Beatrice underlined, we have to look at the opportunities that we can encourage. So these are part of the recommendation that we make on the basis of sector-specific and country-specific analysis built on field trips, adopt a program that will include financing for training, for capacity building, for good practices sharing, and so on and so forth. So these are the recommendations that we make, especially to the European Commission, and I am absolutely delighted to be there with Flavio, who will be probably one of the main policy makers in this domain, and hopefully we will be followed.
Thank you. I actually think you already referred to some extent to what I was going to ask you next, but I'm still going to ask this because this is more specific. So you have in your assessments also assessed the impact of greening of the EU trade policy on developing countries. So you call for the EU to adopt a more development-oriented approach moving forward. So why is that, and what would that entail?
Thank you very much. So you know what, Flavio referred to that in his opening speech. In 2019, the young European citizens went to vote in a massive manner. The rise of the rate of vote was 14%, to be compared with 8% for the rest of the population. And they came with a demand. Please tackle climate change and do it urgently. And so this is why Mrs. von der Leyen came very rapidly with the Green Deal proposal. And we entered very rapidly into a series of proposals in many, many domains that were set for tackling climate change. The impact of the measures that were taken, like the CBAM or the EU deforestation regulation, were not really at the center of the reflection. They were rather afterthoughts. And this explains that the reactions, we went to Geneva with Pascal Lamy 1 year ago. We had a dinner organized by the representative of the EU with ambassadors coming from all around the world. And we saw to which point the unilateral measures that had been taken by the EU were triggering not only worries, but very defensive reaction and accusations of green protectionism or imperialism. And so it was really necessary to put this notion of the impact on developing countries at the center of the reflection. And what we have proposed, I think it was in June last year, is to consider the problem not just as greening trade, but as a triangle, which is the nexus between trade, environment, and development. So put it at the center, and it will have three consequences. First, a new narrative. Second, a differentiated approach. And third, new tools. So first, a new narrative. We can build this narrative on a notion which is not really present in the WTO, but rather in the UNFCCC convention, which is the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, as well as unequal capacities. So this narrative, in a certain manner, for a person like me who was with Jacques Delors in Rio in 1992, is very natural. And it comes from ethics. And just look at the reality of the historical reality. We are, as developed countries, we are at the origin of most of the CO2 emissions. And we are at the origin of most of deforestation happening worldwide. So we have a huge historical responsibility. But not only that, we also have the financial and technical means to face this responsibility. And that is what has to be recognized very clearly, and the consequences of this situation have to be drawn in and put in action. So that's the first point, a new narrative. Second, a differentiated approach. All the members of what is sometimes called the Global South are not at all in the same situations. So we have to recognize this reality and to act accordingly. There are emerging countries which have started to be themselves big emitters of CO2 and who themselves are triggering deforestation and other depletion of resources worldwide. And you have very small and poor countries which are suffering from what we are doing and not taking part to the depletion of our common environment. So this notion of being very specific in our action, country-specific and sector-specific, is a notion that also emerged from this dinner that we had in Geneva. Everybody agreed on the triangle approach, but also on this specificity. And finally, new tools. You know probably the JETPs that were invented in Glasgow to tackle climate change. It is not, it is something which is the initiative of some countries towards a country, which is really targeted. I like to take the example of Mozambique, which is not yet reality as far as I understand. Mozambique is a poor country, triggering revenues from exporting aluminium. But this aluminium, it's 8% of the aluminium exported to the EU. This aluminium is produced with coal coming from South Africa. So it will have to pay the CBAM if the situation remains the same. So the idea we have is to help Mozambique bring hydroelectricity, because they have hydroelectricity, towards their premises in Maputo, and so to green their aluminium production. And what we propose is a notion which is inspired by the JETPs, but with a trade element towards countries that are exporting to the EU and would need to green their exports. And we have called it ETEPs, Environment and Trade, I don't remember for the P, but partnerships. So that is one of the tools that we propose, and I think that I will reserve the next one to your last question.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, being aware of the time, I now ask you to be very, very brief.
Yes.
But because everything is always happening around Geneva as your dinner, so you have called for the development of a global triangle forum to foster dialogue and cooperation on trade, environment, and development nexus at the WTO. So very briefly.
Yeah. I will be brief. I'm very
Yeah.
sorry. I like to tell stories. So I will be brief and go to the point. There is a Trade and Environment Committee in the WTO, and this Trade and Environment Committee, which is chaired by Holim, is a place where development issues are starting to be discussed. So it is, according to me, because this can be discussed, there are other options, but I would say, according to me, this is the most obvious place where we could put together these three elements of the triangle that we propose to create, which is trade, environment, and development triangle, to discuss the three notions at international level and take appropriate measures.
Thank you very much. I would say well done or excellently done. Thank you so much for guiding us through what you have done, and I love the story, and I think if people wouldn't be so hungry, we would be really delighted to listen to your story for a longer time. But unfortunately, we need to move on. So to our third and last panelist, Matthew. So your brief reflection on how sustainable is global agricultural trade?
Yeah, so thank you, Mary, and to the full team that's brought us here all together today. It's really a privilege to be joining this excellent panel and speaking with you here in the room and those who join us online as well. In preparing for this discussion, I found myself getting into some admittedly slightly nerdy questions about what the data says in terms of the composition of global trade flows in agricultural products, and basically sort of what indicators you would want to look at to know whether these are sustainable or not. But as it turns out, I think this meeting today really couldn't be more timely to answer this question, because part of the answer is really kind of there in front of us in plain sight. We've seen very forceful mobilizations of farmers in recent weeks, not just in Europe. I work at the European Climate Foundation, so my answer is going to be infused with this perspective. But I'm going to try to go beyond that as much as I can and also reflect on what's going on internationally here. I think what's very telling about the current situation is that there are essentially two fairly distinct groups that are both on the front lines of farming that are saying in a kind of resounding way, no, global agricultural trade is not sustainable in its current form. To take one of those groups, we have farmers here in the EU who have mobilized very prominent demonstrations here in Brussels, but also in several member states over the last month. And one of the main demands that we can identify from that is really the call for protection from foreign imports. Protection from who depends on where in Europe you are. But there is this notion that there's a competition, and that competition is not necessarily subject to the same conditions of production as in Europe. But as I'm sure we've all heard it many, many times now, it's an influential election year. It's not just an election year in Europe. It's a substantial portion of the world that is going to vote this year. And let's just zoom in on India, which also has elections coming up, I think, in the next month or so. There are also farmer protests taking place in India because it's a moment of crisis in terms of farmers being faced with restrictions on their ability to export, but they're also facing a lot of pressure from foreign imports. And so I want to stay with this juxtaposition of the two, because the policy space of these two governments, and excuse the slightly bulky handling of the EU as a government, but there's different policy space here to react. It sort of reflects, I think, the underlying instability in the rules that govern international agricultural trade. And I think it's why something like the WTO agreement on agriculture has probably passed its expiry date in terms of usefulness to face the current global challenges that are in front of us. It's, of course, why there are efforts to reform that. But what you see with something like the agreement on agriculture is that effectively wealthy countries have locked in kind of historical levels of support to farmers, while developing countries that haven't had the fiscal space to provide extensive subsidies to their domestic agriculture are now more limited in their ability to do so. Even though they're, experiencing higher population growth, they're more exposed to sort of the potential supply disruptions that we are starting to see and can probably expect to see more of in the coming years. So it means you essentially have two kind of blocks of producing countries that are at very different starting points when it comes to trade and agriculture. And it makes it very difficult to reach agreement on how to move forward on big systemic challenges like mitigating the climate externalities of agricultural production, but also making that production more resilient. And I think that's why we saw, at the WTO ministerial conference that wrapped up last week, there was an agenda item on new agricultural rules, and it was postponed, I think, to the next conference in 2 years before this one even started. So to wrap up, I mean, to be clear, there is very good data out there from the World Bank, from the OECD, FAO, WTO, UNEP, and many others on this question. But I think the non-technical answer, I would say, is that if the people who are meant to operate within this system are telling you that they're disenfranchised and they're not getting their fair shot, then the system is not going to be sustainable in the long term.
Thank you. So, being very aware of the time, I'm very sorry for this. I'm going to bundle my two following questions together. So, first of all, I want to ask about the pioneering Foresight study, The Future of Trade in a Net Zero World, that was published last year. It explores the future of trade on a changing planet and within a changing geopolitical climate. So, briefly, what were the key insights of the study regarding trade we want and trade we need moving forward in the changing climate, and especially from the perspective of agriculture and land use? And then, if you could, in a one sentence, bundle nicely key recommendations for the EU moving forward.
So I'll do my best. We took away kind of maybe a package of 7 recommendations from the report, but I think I can slim those down a bit. And for those who might not have seen it yet, we have a couple of copies of the report here in the room, but it's also available digitally online at netzerotrade.org with some complementary resources as well, side research that we've done. But I think, basically in a nutshell, as a climate foundation that's been working on trade for a few years now, I think we were admittedly a bit surprised about the relative lack of vision, sort of a long-term vision for international trade and trade policy. I think the climate community is used to thinking on kind of like a long horizon with timelines out until 2040, 2050 and beyond. And it seems like in terms of more international trade policy questions, there's sort of more of a sense of being stuck in polycrisis and having to look at pretty short-term questions in sort of a defensive and reactive way, rather than thinking about the kind of positive rules that we would need to manage the net zero transition. But at the ECF, we do think that trade is very much part of the solution here, and I think it's probably a view that we all hold. It's a powerful tool of economic governance, and the net zero transition really requires rewiring basically every aspect of our economy over the coming decades. So that's a transition that needs to be managed. What we did in practice, just to summarize that pretty quickly for anyone who's not familiar with strategic foresight, we launched this project just over a year ago now. We brought together a group of more than 80 experts from diverse fields, so economics, law, environment, social policy, industry. These, of course, many of these are cross-cutting as well. And we did over a dozen workshops that had the goal of building out a series of scenarios structured around a set of factors that were deemed by the group to be influential for the future of trade and climate action. I think, so given that we intended for this project to look at some pretty existential questions, it's not a surprise, I think, that the first influential factor that this group came up with is the extent to which agricultural production will be disrupted by a changing climate and whether governments will trend towards either trade openness or restrictiveness as a response. We saw that play out in sort of, across 3 different explorative scenarios that we came up with in some strikingly different ways. I mean, I think essentially we had 2 scenarios where there were severe disruptions, and as a management strategy for that, governments were taking more of an inward look, relying more on, let's say, techno-solutionist approaches, and turning their backs sort of on international markets. There was one scenario where there was a more collaborative approach. Interestingly enough, it was the scenario where the climate impacts were the most extreme, actually. So what does that mean? It means that the group that we brought together actually did see a logically consistent combination of factors where you have very severe disruptions to agricultural production and to the transport of agricultural products. But rather than responding to that shock with more trade restrictiveness, it was deemed plausible that actually governments could take that as a trigger to really do a prioritization in terms of what trade flows need to remain, but to take a sort of cooperative, we're all in this together approach. So let me just summarize, because I know we're a bit under time pressure here as well, but I think what these scenarios did, we didn't use this to make predictions, but we did use this exercise to sort of map out what the uncertainties are in terms of global trade over the next 2 decades, and to also chart a bit of a vision for what we would like it to look like. So we also asked the group to come up with a normative vision and to put together some of the strategic policy options, which I'm going to summarize in one sentence at the end. But basically the normative vision of what this group thinks that trade could look like has 4 main pillars. So the first is a new form of eco-social contracts, which I think are actually particularly relevant for farmers who are working in such close proximity with nature. The second pillar is tax reforms and international cooperation to put up the financing needed to support this kind of more ecologically responsible production. Third, common international principles on measuring the impacts of production in terms of effects like greenhouse gas emissions, but also biodiversity. And then finally, an updated package of trade rules that strikes a better balance between the legitimate interests of developing and developed countries, but is also in tune with our planetary boundaries. Okay, now the hard part. Getting all the recommendations into one sentence. look, the easiest one to point to here, I think, is the dialogue component. I mean, I think it's no secret that from the European perspective, there is an ambition to move quickly on certain impacts that we're observing on the planet. But like I said in the beginning, we're not all starting from the same entry points here. And so I think we need to recognize that there are also very legitimate social and developmental concerns at stake. And the last thing that we want is for climate ambition or for environmental protection to be seen as part of the problem. So I think there's a great exercise for the many talented diplomats to do in terms of explaining what the objectives are in terms of European environmental policy, in terms of something like the Green Deal, but also being prepared to listen and identify the opportunities to shape these constructively. Let me leave it there, but I'm also happy to elaborate during Q&A.
All right, thank you. I think it was a very good, I wouldn't say listing, but you really summed up nicely the recommendations and the work. And now, because I know everybody is so hungry, but we still have questions coming in. So I will now, because I'm here in this position and we have the panelists here, so I will only take questions from, or the online questions. So first, a question for Flavia. So you mentioned the deforestation regulation. So what measures is the Commission taking to preempt that this regulation backfires in terms of leading to the exclusion of developing economies, small-scale farmers from global value chains?
That's indeed a very good question, which touches upon many of the points that the panelists have also touched upon in their interventions. It's a big effort that the Commission and the EU, as a Team Europe, EU, so Commission plus Member States, is doing. It's a government-to-government effort in terms of explanation of how this regulation would work and how it would be implemented during from the period possibly end of this year onwards. And this takes the format of several bilateral meetings. In the multilateral context, the DG Klima, Director General DG Klima, went a month ago to Geneva to explain how the deforestation regulation will work in front of all the members of the WTO. So it's a continuous effort that our colleagues, in particular DG Klima, are doing on explaining how this regulation could be and should be implemented, in particular by smallholders. And then there are a number of specific measures or specific platforms to explain and make sure that producers in third countries are also correctly understanding and also correctly possibly implementing the regulation. I can mention, for example, the multi-stakeholder platform, which meets regularly with the business association and government association also from third countries. There are reports which are also online, and you can easily download that. There is an observatory on deforestation, which also is tasked with monitoring the deforestation situation in third countries and also making sure that the conditions set in the deforestation regulations can be applicable and implementable on the ground. There is, I mentioned, a Team Euro approach, which is the Commission plus the Member States, in particular France, the Netherlands and Germany, who put together 70 million euro in terms of assistance for making sure that the commitments taken are duly implemented. And there is also an information technology platform, in particular a training session that is due to take place in the summer this year, which will try to explain how, from an information technology point of view, the deforestation regulation can be applicable, because, for example, the question, the commitment, or the compliance with the geolocation of the parcel which are producing, which have to be traced in terms of guaranteeing that a product doesn't come from deforested land, all these commitments can be properly implemented. It's a challenge, but there are huge resources that our colleagues, in particular in DG Clima, are putting forward in trying to make sure that this approach is really an approach which is endorsed by producers in third countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. Then another question to keep our gender balance. So, Geneviève, just in 1 minute, could you please give your view? So regarding the global triangle you mentioned, how effective would this be at the WTO given the deadlock that the WTO currently finds itself in?
Okay, excellent question. But I listened also to Christophe, who is coming back from Abu Dhabi and who is not desperate from the fact that the declaration at the end of MC13 is less advanced on sustainability than the previous one. And I think he's right. Reality are stronger than anything else. And the reality is that climate change is more and more disturbed and threatening everybody around the world. And finally, people should understand that trade is part of the solution and that we have to act all together. And then I think that the WTO is well placed, at least as a place for dialogue. And the correspondence between WTO and UNFCCC are really strengthened. They are growing. It started last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, but it was the case this year in Dubai. We were in Dubai. And the question of the trade and climate nexus was really took a very important place in Dubai. So there are reasons to hope, and I think that there is an expertise and a place for dialogue in WTO that should be used.
Thank you very much. And indeed, the optimistic picture also goes to the other end of the table. As we heard that there are a lot of things that have actually proceeded in the WTO, at the WTO, trade and sustainable, trade and environmental sustainability discussions, well, even going back further, 2015 export subsidies and so on. So there are things moving forward, even though we have this very difficult geopolitical, let's say, new order. That is really influencing the work multilaterally, but also bilaterally, and it's dividing the world. However, we heard during this session the importance of finance. On almost all the interventions mentioned finance as a key to drive sustainable trade in agriculture. We need cooperation at multilateral fora, even though we have difficult times. The EU is taking a new approach to trade policy. It's adding autonomous tools, but it's also not closing third countries outside of the scope of trade, but it's trying to cooperate and collaborate, as we heard, these projects and the finance from different ends of the table that the EU is actually putting in making trade more sustainable and helping developing countries to take up green practices. We also heard how important local level experience is when we talk about trade and the impacts of trade. We heard also in the first session today the local level experience, and that we have found out that there are good practices, but we really need to find out how to scale up these good practices. And again, closing the session, we go back to having finance, trade finance, investments, and basically the enabling tools for the transition. To this, I really want to thank all the panelists here and our audience here in the room and also online. So thank you very much.